Hello everyone. In this session of machine learning and data science, we'll be talking about classes and objects. So let's just start the topic. So to lay out what we are going to learn here, we are going to look at classes and objects. We are going to dabble a little bit into the init function, the self parameter, and we'll also see how we can modify an object properties as well as creation of object methods. So let's open our SPIDER IDE and start working on that. Okay, so Python is a object oriented programming language. So everything here has an object, it has its corresponding methods and all. So first let's look at a simple class. A class can be considered as a simple constructor, right? So how do we go ahead for defining a particular class? So for that we'll be using the keyword class. Say let me call my function as test, and here inside this I'll have my class related code. Say suppose I will say that x is equal to 5. In other very simple terms, this class can be considered as a blueprint for creating objects. So basically that is how you can define a simple class. So here how do I utilize this particular class, means how do I create that particular object and how do I use it? So the simple way to use it is I'll take a variable p. I will say p is equal to, okay, I will assign my class test. Okay, so here whenever I'm doing this, that implies that I'm creating an instance for that particular test to be consumed. So I have an object created. Okay, so now I'm going to print p dot x, means this x is the corresponding variable in the class test. So if I execute this, what will happen? This p is marked to the class test. So this is the object that is created and based on the class which is called as test, and here I am passing the value of this particular class. So if I execute this, you can see the value 5 is printed in the output window. So this is nothing but your definition of a simple class and how an object is created for the particular class and how it is used. Now this is the simplest implementation of a class. So you usually don't have such simple scenarios. You'll have some complex scenarios where you perform number of functions. You have functions defined inside a class, and those functions perform specific operations and all. So let's look at a very small example of how a particular class is defined in the real world. For an example, we can take two numbers, say age 1 and age 2, and what we can do is that we can print the largest of this age 1 and age 2, means the oldest person's age is represented. So let me just go ahead and show you how such examples could be implemented. So inside the class test, right, basically we always start our definition to include an init function. So we'll have an init function. Init function is usually written as underscore underscore init. Okay, and here we will define a parameter that refers and will be able to access all the values inside that particular function. So I'll define it as self. Now self is a keyword. Okay, so this self keyword which is there, right, it defines and it provides the access to all the variables inside the particular class. So I'll take self, I'll call it age 1 comma age 2. Okay, and here I'll give a definition. If a1 is greater than a2, right, print a1 is greater, okay, plus a1, value a1. I will say else I'll take the same string and I will print a2, right? So if at all, if whichever variable is greater than this particular class related value, that particular variable is printed. Now how do we go ahead and create an object for this? So here we have the object creation template here, right? So p is equal to test bracket, and inside this bracket what I will do is that I will give the values a1 and a2. So I will give 25 comma 35. Okay, now if I call this particular function, right, if I call this particular function, it should actually give me the values of the a1 and a2, right? Okay, so before we do that, let us just just pay attention to one small detail here. Here the a1 is a integer value and a2 is also an integer value, but this is a string, so you might get a typecast error whenever you execute this particular class. So let me just put in the typecasting of a1 to string and a2 to string. Okay, now when I execute this one, it should give me whichever is the greatest value. So I am just going ahead, I define the object and I call the class, right? I have the object ready, and now it has to print me the value, right? So if you see here, the value a2 is greater with a value of 35. So that is the value that is given. Now so far we have seen how the init function would be used, but we never actually experience the usage of self inside a class. So like I told you before, the self is a parameter that lets you access all the variable sets inside the class. So here I can write something like this: self dot a1 equal to a1 and self dot a2 equal to a2. Okay, now when I do this p dot test, what happens is whatever variables that I'm passing, 25 or 35, whichever values I'm passing, those values are assigned to and available inside the class. So this utility of self comes in whenever I am writing methods inside a class. So technically how would I do that is that, suppose I want to print the age, right, the greatest age. So I will do a definition, okay, and I'll do a compare, right, it's a compare function. Okay, and here instead of giving a1, a2 and all that, right, I will just say self. So if I do self here, that implies that all the variables a1 and a2 will be available inside this particular method, right? So if self dot a1 is greater than self dot a2, okay, so I'm going to write it down here, right? So print a1 is greater and its value is, so again I use a typecast here, right, a1. Okay, else I will do print a2. Okay, now again don't go towards the completion of this logic, this is silly. There could be an equal to clause or defined as well, but this is how you could actually use the values that are present inside the loop. Okay, so that a1 is nothing but self dot a1, right, and here the a2 is nothing but self dot a2. Okay, So they can be greater than, less than, or equal to, but I'm just writing for greater than, equal to, and assuming that the values would never come in as equal, which is very incomplete logic, but please don't consider that right now. The main focus of this particular portion of code is to help you understand how methods are written inside a particular user defined particular class. So if I execute this, okay, basically you are not calling the method yet inside the class. So let me show you how to call that particular method inside the class and perform the necessary operation, right? To call the method inside a class, you already have the object defined, right? You have given p is equal to test 25, 35. Okay, so all I have to do to call that method is p dot. Now I will call the compare method inside method, and I will execute the corresponding code logic to obtain my necessary result. So I did p dot compare here. So let me just go ahead and execute this particular piece of code. So when I execute this, it has given me that a2 is greater than greater, and its value is 35. So what it did, I created the object and I called the necessary method for performing the operation. Okay, now here the self is a parameter that allows you to access the variables inside the class. That is something that I've given you earlier during this particular video. But here instead of self, you can use anything else. I can say some say t. So I'll have to define it as t. Okay, so for the sake of simplicity, I can give it as t, and I can use the same thing again, right? So self is not mandatory. Self is just a keyword. Okay, instead of that keyword inside the init, you can use a t that refers to that particular variable value. So even then that would function. So we have looked at what's a class, right? We have looked at the init function. Okay, we have looked at self, and also we have looked at instead of self what else can we use. Okay, and we have seen how an object is defined and how we call a method, how we call an object method to perform a certain set of operation here, okay, inside a class. So let's move ahead and let's look at some more examples. Now consider a scenario where I want to change the value of this 25 to some other value. Okay, so suppose I want to change it to 45, right? So here earlier my p dot compare I have written here as 25. So here I can say p dot a1 equals to 45. Okay, so when I do this, what will happen? Earlier the p dot a1 value was assigned as 25. Now I can do a modification of this value later on in the phase where it will take a different value. So let me just put the p dot compare again here. So what happens, let us see. So first I took the p, I took this is my object, and then I called the object method compare. Okay, so earlier it should print that a2 is the greater value. Now I have changed the a1 to have a value of 45. Now let us see how it functions. So let's go ahead and execute this one. Okay, so first for the first compare, it had printed a2 is greater and its value is 35. And then what I did, I modified the value of a1 here in this particular method that I call in this particular object that I called, right? So here you can always modify the values. So I can say p dot a1 is equal to 45, and then I did a compare operation. So it said a2 is greater and its value is 45. Okay, so this is how the values inside inside the objects can be modified. So let's look at one more example where we can actually delete the value of a particular object that is given. So I can do something of this sort. Let me just remove this complete code set. So I have p is equal to test 25 comma 35. So I'll print, okay, p dot a1, okay, and I'll do a print of p dot a2. Okay, so when I do this, what will happen? So here 25 and 35 are given. So for deleting any value that is inside the particular object, so I can do delete p dot a1. Now let's see what happens if I try to print it, right? I have not assigned any value. Okay, so let me just go ahead and run that. Okay, so you can see here that first I have given p dot test. In the p dot test I have given 25 comma 35 and I did a print p of a1. Okay, so when I did this, it did 25 and 35. Okay, now I did delete p of a1. Okay, when I did delete p of a1, in that object itself the a1 value is removed and it is no longer present. So when I try to print it, what happens? It will say that the test object has no attribute a1 because I already deleted it. Okay, so this is another modification that you can make on the object variables. So we have seen basic class definition, we have seen init functions, we have we created a method inside a particular class, right? We have used the utilization of that particular method inside the class. Then we have looked at modification of variables of a class. We have looked at self, and apart from self, what else we can use. Okay, and also we have looked at modification and delete operations, right? So now here let me just remove this and let me just call p dot compare again. Okay, now here in this class, right, I have given t. Here I don't need to give a t because I'm referring to those variables inside the class itself, right? So I can say call it as x, right? So instead of t I can call it as x as well, but still it would refer to the set of variables that I'm prescribing for that particular object. So here these two need not be the same variable. Instead of self, here I used t and here I used x. So if I do compare, let's see what happens. Okay, so you can see here t is just referring to the variables that are accessible inside the class, and when I define the method, I gave, instead of t I gave some variable x. Okay, so when I gave that x, it what it did is that it took that assignment of that particular variable x, and then it will actually go ahead and perform the operation, and it will assign that x to the value t. Means here whatever I give, it will refer to the variables that are accessible inside the class, that is t dot a1 and t dot a2. Okay, so this is one more aspect of using the self and not using the self to actually perform a set of operations and object methods and all. Okay, so this concludes our session on classes and objects. We'll talk about inheritance in the next session. Thank you so much. Please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, and also please click the bell icon to receive notifications about my latest videos.